Hello, and welcome to another Old Scams in Shiny New Packages podcast. On these podcasts, we use 20th century experiences and ideas to better understand 21st century scams, risks, and potential approaches. My name is John P. Raberger, and I'm here with my podcasting collaborator, Don Wood. Hello, Don.
Hello, John.
Don, today I would like to talk about why exactly we want to do these podcasts. Sort of what's our motivation? What is driving us to do this? Why do we wake up in the morning and decide we want to do a podcast on old scams and shiny new packages? Would you like to start?
Well, that's what we're here to do, and it's going to be, I think, a enjoyable and hopefully educational series of podcasts that we have in mind to talk about a little bit about the history of the internet, how it got started, why privacy was not one of the elements of the first iteration of the internet, and why we're still dealing with that today, and some of the ways that we can understand privacy in terms of what life used to be like before the internet came along, using some analogies to help educate and promote some awareness, particularly amongst those who of a certain age that still remember things like postcards and writing checks.
Yeah, I agree. My motivation is because I see too many old people being scammed by scammers, and they don't need to be. I'm convinced that we might have a potential to help people who might be affected by scammers. The FBI says that a person most likely to be scammed is 60 years or older because they have an absence of experience with the internet and they tend to be more affluent than average. So I think that's a very vulnerable population, and I hope these podcasts help. The other thing is, I think you and I are in a somewhat unique position, given our age, to essentially talk to older people about changes that have occurred in their lives and provide 20th century analogies to essentially 21st century problems. And I don't know when you got your first cell phone, but I got my first cell phone in 1997, which was basically half my lifetime ago. So, in a real way, I essentially spent half my lifetime with a cell phone and half my lifetime pre cell phone with, as you said, postcards and paper checks and the clicky credit card reader. Remember those?
Oh, yes.
And mailing things and actually talking to people long distance. Remember long distance calls when that was a thing?
Well, you had to wait until after hours to save money to
Right.
make a long distance call. You really
Yeah.
had to plan. And then you had station to station calls and you had collect calls and all of that, of course, is gone. But you're right. That's sort of the mindset that we had. And this change now over the past 30 years has totally turned that upside down.
Yeah. And the other thing is the internet has been around since the 1970s, but it was popularized in the mid 1990s, specifically with the introduction of Netscape and the modern web browser. That created the internet boom in the late 1990s, where it was .com this and .com that, most famously pets.com, which flamed out incredibly. So essentially, half our lives have been internet affected, and half our lives were pre-internet. Now the internet existed, it was just not readily available to most consumers, or they were not aware of it. So, I remember back in the old days when you had to print out MapQuest directions because you couldn't put that on your phone. Or I actually did a trip years ago on an internet predecessor called Prodigy, which was IBM's kind of consumer oriented dial up internet that was a competitor to America Online. And I booked places literally all over the Western United States based on Prodigy, and then did a trip based on those bookings, and it worked.
Ooh, high tech.
High
High tech.
tech. And then you had to wait for the dial up, and nobody else could be on the phone line at the same time. And so the good old days weren't all that good. But I think we are in a somewhat unique situation to talk across this kind of information technology boundary that people who were born a lot older or much older than us, like 10 years older than us, probably have a much harder time. Now, I don't mean to say all older people have a hard time with technology, but there's a concept called a digital native. And that is somebody who grew up with a cell phone, grew up with the internet, as a different perspective than someone who didn't. And by way of analogy, my mother grew up in a rural, poor area, and she did not have a telephone. And I was a telephone native. During my whole life, we always could make phone calls, and she grew up in an environment before they could make phone calls. So she was not a telephone native, and I was. And now my kids are digital natives who are very familiar with internet, have always had cell phones, don't know anything different, don't really understand a time before that, to be honest with you. And hopefully we can bridge this gap by talking about issues and scams that have basically crossed this kind of intellectual boundary from the old 20th century days to the new 21st century days. And the scammers, their motivations haven't really changed. The techniques, I'm not sure, have really changed a lot. Just the technology and the reach has certainly changed quite a bit.
So, in terms of terms, I like that digital native. So, in your understanding of that term, you and I, and those of us in our generation, 60 and above, say, we are not digital natives. Is that
Correct.
right?
Correct. We are not digital natives because we did not grow up. It was not part of our formative years. The internet was something that was an add-on to our life, basically. I mean, I distinctly remember life before the internet. Most of my college years were before the internet. My early professional life when we just got a computer and it wasn't connected to anything. And then we had to take the floppy drive out if we wanted to get it printed and take it to someplace else. And so, yes, digital native means someone who basically grew up and doesn't know anything different.
John, you reminded me of when you talked about your first cell phone. I almost returned my first cell phone because there was no dial tone. I turned it on. I was so excited. I was going to make my first cell phone call to somebody, and nothing. There wasn't that comforting noise that we're so used to hearing before you dial the phone.
That is hilarious.
That's sort of the level of ignorance that we had, back in those days. And I still feel ignorant, as we move on through things like social media and
Sure,
all of
sure.
the kinds of scams we're going to talk about later. We're really kind of in a revolutionary time still. In fact, we're taking off now with artificial intelligence. So all of this, I think, is going to be interesting to go through with you over the next few episodes.
Oh, thank you. And I think it should be interesting. And I really think there's a need here. And part of my professional experience in the technology world was explaining complex situations, problems to senior executives who didn't have a lot of time and wanted it simplified, but not dumbed down so much as to be condescending. And they wanted to understand things, and you had to use different metaphors, different ways of thinking about things to communicate clearly. And so if people today talk about scams from a technology perspective only, I think the people who are most vulnerable, who are not digital natives, are going to miss that because it's not a part of their native tongue to talk about processors and password and encryption and stuff like that, you have to communicate with people in the language that they understand. And I'm convinced a lot of these people can't understand concepts like dial tone from the 20th century. And if we can translate 20th century ideas to be used for 21st century problems, I think that's a real value added.
Yeah, I agree. And I hope that we can achieve that through this series of podcasts. One of the interesting things that we talk about the old days, and you had brought this up in the show notes, maybe we can include that in the show notes later, is that the GAO report to Congress in 1995 called Information Superhighway. And that's a term, talk about analogies. That's an analogy right there. And we don't talk about information superhighway anymore. That's sort of past. But in those days we did, because we thought about it as information that was traveling so fast and there were no red lights or green lights. It was just constantly moving. And so that's the very beginning, really, I think, of the kinds of things we'll be talking about, which are these analogies, trying to explain those analogies. And you were actually part of that report.
Yes, I was. That was actually heavily influenced by Senator and then Vice President Al Gore. The interesting background story there is when his father was a senator, was involved in the Eisenhower program that created the interstate highway system.
There you go.
So Al Gore, when he became a senator, envisioned something akin to that, but with information. Now, he thought it would be federally owned. He didn't really know the technology. And at the time, there were a bunch of companies out there, most prominently IBM, who had their own vision of what the information superhighway would look like. Yeah, I've been doing this a long time, and that was sort of how I first became familiar with this whole concept. And I remember back then, it was really mind-blowing for people to think that they could easily communicate with somebody from another city and didn't have to call or write, but electronically communicate with them. That was a really mind-blowing experience for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Do you remember your first email?
I do not remember my first email. I mean, personal email or work email?
Oh, either.
I
think I remember my first work email too. I remember my first private citizen email, and it was about the time this report was written, 1995. It was an email I sent. I was living in San Francisco. I sent it to a friend in Oakland, and it was the most amazing thing I'd ever done. When he replied and said, "Yes, I've got your email," I felt like it was something that must have been like the first telephone call or the first telegram. Astonished that I could communicate with somebody without using a telephone instantly.
Yeah.
Now, that was only 30 years ago.
I know.
That's well within our lifetime. So I think we should pat ourselves on the back, you and I and others of our age, that non-digital natives, that we've witnessed this kind of change in such a very short period of time. Really, it's a industrial revolution in just a few very short years.
Yeah, I agree. I think for people older than us and someone who's recently passed away or passed away a couple of years ago is sort of my frame of reference, somebody that we both know. And if you didn't see it in the workplace or in your personal life and you left the workplace in the 80s, there was a lot of change that happened in the 1990s. And that's a steep learning curve for a lot of people. And I think older people like that are vulnerable because maybe they didn't go through the steep learning curve, or else they think there's some kind of magic to the new scams when it's really just people trying to steal from you or trying to fool you into doing something. The stuff that people did years ago with the Nigerian prince letters, who sent the Nigerian prince who sent you a letter years ago who said, I have $20 million and I just need $10,000 from you to unlock it, and I will send you a quarter of the $20 million. I mean, somebody is just trying to rip you off. And they did it in paper before, and then they did it in email, and now they do it on social media. So, the underlying scam hasn't really changed. The technology has, and the reach of these people have, but the underlying scam really hasn't changed.
And that's why in lonely moments, I sometimes go to my spam folder. There's just so many potential friends there that want to give me money or want to take me out on a date or so on. And that even the spam folder is something relatively new. When email came along, we didn't have spam. Well,
Right.
we did. It was in the grocery store. It's the products, meat product, or people who manufacture ham. Spam. I'm not sure. Hormel are really pleased with how their product has been likened to junk email, but we didn't have that then. Now we've got that spam folder. Now we have a way of kind of removing some of the clutter, but that's just so old-fashioned now. The new scams and the shiny new packages that we're going to talk about are way more sophisticated than that, and it really does take vigilance to be able to navigate your way out of it. And we're really we've got to use the internet now, because if you want paper statements, oftentimes you're going to have to pay for those, a $5 or $10 fee every quarter. I've got a relative who still gets her statements by mail. She wants them that way, even though it's costing her money. So we're really being forced into this, whether we like it or not. We've got to figure out a way, especially for those of us of a certain age, to be able to get through this. And I think as we probably will move through these podcasts, the goal is really to explain the scams in language that we can all understand, and also give some helpful tips to be able to keep ourselves out of harm's way.
Yeah, I agree with that. The helpful tips is hopefully we can provide some insight and to help to people and stuff like that. And because the truth of the matter is, anybody who's been around for very long probably has gotten fooled or tricked to some degree by somebody. And it's not something to be embarrassed about. Matter of fact, I have a funny story about that, in that I used to do training on phishing scams. A phishing scam is somebody who sends you a message or something like that with a link to a fake website, and you click on it and go to that fake website. Well, the organization I was in sent out test messages for phishing test messages to see who would respond. And the consequence of clicking on a bad test phish message was to take the training. And so I was in too big of a hurry, and I clicked on an email that I shouldn't have clicked on, and I got sent to the training for the very training that I had been working on phishing.
Busted.
So,
you were
busted, having to take the training I was developing. I had to take it myself because I was just in too big a hurry and too eager to get through the messages. And so everybody gets fooled every now and then. It's not a matter of if, it's more a matter of when. It's just the severity can be minimized. The awareness can be improved. That's what I'm motivated to do.
Good. Well, I think we'll have a good series of podcasts. I hope, anyway, that we'll be able to go through some of the history and some of the ideas and tips to help those who, as you say, might feel embarrassed but shouldn't.
Thank you, Don. And I will end this podcast by saying, don't be afraid. Modern scams are just old scams in shiny new packages. Farewell.